For the next step in Paul's defense of his gospel, here in 3:1 to 5:15, Paul is going to make a redemptive historical argument in which he roots his message, his gospel, justification by faith, deep into Israel's story, proving that faith is more central to what it means to be a Jew than even observance of the law is. And then next, he's going to examine and explain this moment of transition in redemptive history from the time when one was a member of the family of God by observance of the law, and now to the time when the family of God is composed of all nations who have faith like Abraham. Let's take a look first here in 3:15 to 18, in which Paul argues that his gospel was preached to Abraham long before the law came by Moses. Let's see that in the text. So here in 3:8, this is such an interesting little verse. It says that the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham. And here in 3:6, it says that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham had faith, and that faith justified him. But why does that order matter? Or why does it matter that faith came before the law? Well, Paul is going to make a legal argument. He's going to say that you cannot go back and change a covenant that's already been made. Let's see how he makes that case here in chapter 3, where he says in 3:15 to give a human example. He calls it a human example. Even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has already been ratified. You see, the law under Moses came 430 years after the promise to Abraham, and therefore the law does not annul or change or ratify or alter a previously made covenant. So if the covenant to Abraham was a covenant of promise in which justification and blessing were promised to Abraham by faith, the law cannot, 430 years later, come and say, you're going to have justification by faith and law and observance to the law. For if that was the case, then the law would make the promise void. The next step in Paul's argument, we're going to look at the beginning of chapter 3:1 to 14. And here, Paul says that this covenant of promise made with Abraham is a covenant of blessing. However, the Mosaic covenant, it is a curse covenant. The Mosaic covenant is a curse covenant. And that's strong language, but let's see, let's demonstrate that by looking at the text where Paul is going to explicitly call it a curse covenant. He says that for all who rely on the works of the law, they are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all of the things written in the book of the law and do them. This is a curse covenant because they had to do everything. If they failed in any one point, they were in violation of the law and were no longer justified by works. However, Jesus redeemed the Jews from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for them and dying on a tree. And now, let's see. Now, in Christ, the blessing of Abraham, given to Abraham and his descendants, is extended to all nations who have faith like Abraham. And this doesn't mean that all nations become Jews. That's what the Judaizers want, right? They want all the nations to become Jews. Rather, they enter into the blessing of Abraham by faith, and they're called sons of Abraham. We'll see that here. In verse 7, know that it is those of faith who are called sons of Abraham, and they are blessed alongside Abraham, the man of faith, because of their faith. So Paul's Paul's plea, let's kind of summarize what we've said thus far. Paul's plea to the Gentiles in this section is, Gentiles, you do not need to be circumcised in order to be members of God's covenant family, for you are already sons of Abraham by faith, and you are already experiencing the blessings of Abraham through your faith. Therefore, if you accept circumcision, you are going to forsake that blessing and enter into a curse covenant. Don't do that, Paul is saying. And next, here in this next section, Paul is going to make the case that being a member of the curse covenant is akin to being a slave, but there is freedom in the new covenant. So here in we're going to jump now to 4:21 to 31. Paul is going to use Abraham's family as an analogy for two covenants. So Abraham bore a son through both Hagar and Sarah. Now, Ishmael was the son of the slave woman, and he was born according to the flesh. That is, of Abraham's own effort, of his works. You remember, he didn't have faith, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to be able to have a son through Sarah, so through my own works, according to the flesh, he had a son through Hagar." Isaac, on the other hand, was born of the free woman, born according to the promise, or according to faith in the promise of God that Abraham would have a son through Sarah. Now, Paul says that this whole situation here may be interpreted allegorically, he says, for two mothers, two sons, and two covenants. Let me show you that in chapter 4. Go down to 4:24. Now this situation explained in these verses may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. We have the present Jerusalem, those who, the Jews now who are under the law and rejecting the Messiah. The present Jerusalem, she is the mother of those who are under the law, and she is bearing children for slavery. She's in slavery to the law, and her children. Her children are in slavery. But the Jerusalem that is above, we have two different mothers. Present Jerusalem is a mother, like Hagar, and the Jerusalem is above is a mother, like Sarah. The Jerusalem above, she is the mother of those who are free, those who are children of the promise. So what Paul is doing here in this section is he's saying, Galatians, you are not members of a works covenant, a covenant in which you must attempt to obtain your justification by works according to the flesh, by attempting and trying harder, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That is not your covenant. The present Jerusalem, she is not your mother. For this kind of justification by works, this different gospel, it is slavery. No, your salvation, Galatians, your salvation is a gift. It is a promise, which you simply have to receive by faith like Abraham. Now, in this section here, the final section that we're going to look at in these chapters, 3:19 to 4:11, Paul is going to anticipate an objection. If the law is so bad, he's going to ask, and it's a curse covenant, well, what was the point of the law in the first place? What was the law for? Why the law, he asks. Well, to answer that question, he is going to depart from his Abraham analogy, and he's going to introduce a new metaphor, the metaphor of a pedagogue. Pedagogue is a Greek word which is translated usually as guardian. And a pedagogue in Greek culture was a slave that Greek families would hire to supervise or watch over their sons, a son when he's young as a child, and the pedagogue was responsible for accompanying this son to and from school, supervising his studies, making sure that he developed good manners. And the pedagogue was oftentimes characterized as being very stern and strict and severe in his discipline of this young child. And Paul says that was the purpose of the law for Israel. The law was Israel's guardian, a temporary guardian, carefully watching over Israel, sternly disciplining Israel until the time when Israel came of age. And when that was the case, then you no longer need a pedagogue when the child reaches maturity. And let me show you how Paul makes this case in chapter 3. I think we're 324. Scroll up, 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 up. The law, he says, was our guardian. And while under this guardian, it held us captive, Paul says. They were imprisoned under the law, under this guardian. And while under, now in chapter 4, while under a guardian and a manager, the child, even though he's the heir of the whole estate, the child is no different than a slave. And that's the case that's being made here. The child, he's imprisoned, he's held captive while he's under this guardian, the guardian that is the law. But this is a temporary condition. The child is only considered a child, only kept under the guardian for a limited amount of time until the fullness of time when Christ comes. And I want to examine closely this transition language between one covenant to the next. Look at all this, until something comes. For before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the faith was revealed, until faith came. The law was our guardian until Christ came. Now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. And look here, the child is under a guardian and a manager until the date set by his father. Now we're really coming back into that metaphor of the pedagogue. At that time, the child receives full adoption as a son. He goes from being a child to a son. He receives full adoption as sons, and he's no longer a slave, but he is fully a son, able to inherit the father's estate. But this whole sequence here of a child transitioning into a son, this describes Israel under the law. But what about the Gentiles? These Gentiles were never under the law, never under the guardian, the pedagogue, because the law was a covenant that was made with Israel at Mount Sinai with Moses, right? The Gentiles weren't part of that covenant. However, Paul is going to say that they were under a different kind of slavery. While the law was a slavery that Israel experienced, Gentiles were under a different kind of slavery before Paul brought his gospel message to them. It was a slavery to paganism. And let me show you this in the beginning of chapter 4. So he says, formerly, you Gentiles, when you didn't know God, you were enslaved as well. Just like the Jews were enslaved to the law, so you were enslaved to those that are by nature not God's. I think it's in Iconium or Lystra in Acts 13 or 14, Paul's first missionary journey to Galatia, where Paul he's called Hermes and Apollos is called Zeus. And it's like that they were enslaved to those fictional, made-up gods, those who are by nature not gods. And Paul is going to, like I said, draw a parallel between the slavery of the law and this slavery of paganism. And he's going to call both of them by this curious phrase, the elementary principles of the world. That's slavery to the law, and paganism is also called the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world. And this word elementary principles, it's this word stoicheia. And I love the way that a certain scholar, his name is Gerard Peterman, explains this parallel between the law and paganism. Let me show you. Now, he says that although the two situations, this is the Moody Bible Commentary, although they are very different in many ways, Paul drew a parallel between the Jewish infancy under the law and the Galatians' previous lives in paganism. He's going to call both of them slavery. Both of them were under the elemental things or elementary principles, and both were unable to bring salvations. And look at this key point here. This is our hinge. For the Galatians to return to observing the law was just like returning to paganism again. Look at 4 verse 9. Paul is going to say, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? Paul is going to say, how can you turn back? You are a son, an heir, an owner. You've received the Spirit. How can you, Galatians, turn back to the stoicheia, the elementary principles of the world, a form of slavery? Do you want to be under the law? Do you desire to be a slave? Don't you know that it was for freedom that Christ has set us free? Stand firm, Paul says, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And there's one more step in Paul's defense of his gospel, one final argument, and we're going to take a look at that argument next.